And inside the homes of poor Jewish families, at the time of Jesus, the oil lamp flickers against the rough stone wall, casting elongated shadows across the cramped interior of a home in Nazareth. Outside, a gentle breeze carries the distant bleating of sheep as dawn approaches the Galilean hillside. Inside, the air hangs heavy with the lingering aromas of the previous night's meal, cumin, dried fish, and the ever-present scent of olive oil. A young woman rises silently from her sleeping mat, careful not to disturb the 3 generations of family members sharing the single-room dwelling. Her calloused feet press against the packed earth floor as she moves toward the small cooking hearth, still warm with embers from yesterday. This is not the Jerusalem of marble columns or the Roman governor's palace. This is the hidden reality of first-century Galilee, the everyday world that shaped the vast majority who lived during the time of Jesus. What was it truly like to dwell within these humble walls? How did the physical constraints of such modest homes influence the faith, relationships, and worldview of those who inhabited them? And perhaps most intriguingly, how might understanding these intimate spaces transform our reading of the gospel narratives themselves? The archaeological evidence reveals homes barely larger than modern living rooms, housing extended families of 8 or more. Stone foundations supporting mud brick walls, roofs of wooden beams covered with branches and packed clay that required constant maintenance. Yet within these constraints, the rhythms of Jewish family life unfolded day after day, generation after generation. What wisdom emerged from these shadow-filled rooms that would ultimately shape a faith that would spread across the world? As the morning light slowly illuminates the interior of our Galilean home, revealing its sparse furnishings and the sleeping forms of a family bound by both blood and necessity, we begin our journey into the forgotten domestic reality of Jesus' world, a world where survival and faith were inseparable, where honor meant everything, and where the extraordinary emerged from the most ordinary of circumstances. I invite you to journey with me through the doorway of history. Subscribe, because Jesus is returning and wants you closer to him. By understanding the physical realities that shaped his earthly ministry and the lives of those who first heard his teachings, we develop a deeper connection to the faith that transcends time. These homes, humble as they were, contained the very soil in which the seeds of early Christianity would take root and flourish. In exploring them, we discover not just historical facts, but spiritual insights that continue to resonate in our lives today. To understand the homes of poor Jewish families in first-century Galilee and Judea, we must first comprehend the complex social structure that defined their existence. Under Roman occupation, the Jewish population existed within a carefully stratified society. At the very top stood the Roman officials and their Jewish elite allies, the wealthy priestly families, large landowners, and tax collectors who had aligned themselves with imperial power. These privileged few lived in comparative luxury, with spacious homes featuring multiple rooms, interior courtyards, and imported goods. But they represented a mere fraction of the population. Below them existed the vast majority, the arose, or people of the land. These were the farmers, artisans, day laborers, and small merchants who comprised perhaps 90% of the population. Among them, many families lived in a precarious economic state, just one poor harvest or illness away from destitution. It is within this demographic that we find the typical Jewish family of Jesus' time. Roman rule shaped daily life in ways both obvious and subtle. The heavy burden of taxation, which could claim between 30% and 40% of a family's agricultural production, created a constant economic pressure. There were Roman taxes, temple taxes, and various tolls and tariffs that drained resources from already struggling households. This economic reality forced many families into debt, sometimes leading to the loss of ancestral lands that had been in families for generations. The gospel parables of debtors, day laborers seeking work, and disputes over inheritance reflect this harsh economic landscape. Within this context of scarcity and imperial control, the Jewish family home became more than shelter. It was the foundation of resistance and cultural preservation. The home was where Jewish identity was formed and maintained, where the stories of the Torah were passed down, and where ritual observances continued despite external pressures. The physical structure of these modest dwellings served both practical and spiritual purposes. Archaeological excavations across Galilee, particularly in sites like Capernaum, Nazareth, and Sepphoris, have revealed the typical layout of peasant homes. Most consisted of a single room, sometimes with a smaller second room attached, ranging from 400 to 700 square feet in total area. Multiple generations lived together in this confined space. Parents, children, grandparents, perhaps unmarried aunts or uncles. Privacy, as we understand it today, was virtually non-existent. The concept of personal space would have been foreign to a child growing up in such a setting. Homes were typically clustered together in village formations, often built around shared courtyards where multiple related families would cook, work, and socialize together. These courtyard complexes created an intermediate space between the purely private and the fully public, where neighborhood women might gather to grind grain together, or where extended family would assemble for special meals. This arrangement fostered an intensely communal way of life that stands in stark contrast to our modern notions of individual autonomy and nuclear family isolation. The material possessions within these homes were minimal by modern standards. Archaeological findings suggest most families owned little beyond essential tools, cooking vessels, storage containers, and sleeping mats that would be rolled up during the day.
You are strong.
Wooden furniture was precious and limited.
Walk in the light,
Perhaps a
and God
low
will
table,
protect you.
a few stools, and storage chests for the family's few treasured possessions, which might include a set of Sabbath clothing or inherited jewelry that served as a form of financial security for women. In this environment, honor became a form of social capital more valuable than material wealth. A family's reputation, their maintenance of proper religious observance, their generosity within their means, their daughter's sexual purity, their son's respect for elders, constituted their most precious asset. The physical constraints of village life, where neighbors lived in extraordinarily close proximity and privacy was minimal, meant that maintaining honor required constant vigilance. Water, so central to both physical survival and ritual cleanliness, had to be carried daily from communal wells or cisterns. This task, typically performed by women and children, structured the rhythm of each day and created natural gathering places where news was exchanged, marriages were arranged, and community bonds were strengthened. The gospel story of Jesus meeting the Samaritan woman at the well reflects this social reality, a reality shaped by the physical needs of humble homes. Food preparation dominated much of the day, particularly for women. The grinding of grain into flour, a labor-intensive process that could take hours each day, was often done communally with neighboring women. Bread was the staple of every meal, supplemented with olive oil, legumes, and occasional dairy products. Meat was rare for poor families, reserved for special celebrations or sacrificial meals. Most cooking occurred outdoors, when weather permitted, on simple clay ovens or hearths that used precious fuel efficiently. For families engaged in agriculture, as most were, the home was not merely a dwelling, but the center of an economic unit. The boundaries between work and home would have been non-existent. Farming tools were stored within the home's walls. Harvest processing often occurred in the shared courtyard spaces. Animals might share the living space during cold nights or vulnerable stages of their development. The home was simultaneously workplace, school, religious center, and shelter. This integration of all aspects of life under a single roof or within a small courtyard complex fostered an understanding of existence where the sacred and mundane were not separated as they often are today. When Jesus spoke of the kingdom of God using domestic metaphors, women kneading leaven into bread dough, a woman searching for a lost coin in her home, a lamp placed on a lampstand, he was drawing on the intimate familiarity his audience had with these daily realities. The physical home, humble as it was, became the context through which spiritual truths were understood and transmitted. Dawn arrives early in Galilee, especially during the warm summer months. The first light would find most family members already stirring on their sleeping mats. Sleep was taken seriously in the ancient world, a precious commodity after days of physical labor. Most would have slept on simple reed mats placed directly on the earthen floor, perhaps with woolen blankets during colder months. The family slept in close proximity to one another, arranged according to age and gender when space permitted, but always within the safety of shared walls. Morning began with the practical necessities. Before anything else, water had to be fetched. Young women of the household would take clay jugs to the communal village well or cistern, timing their visit to avoid the heat of the day. This water gathering was not merely a chore, but a social occasion, a time when young people might interact under the watchful eyes of the community, where marriages could be arranged, and where village news spread from household to household. The water carried home would be carefully rationed throughout the day, some for cooking, some for drinking, and a portion set aside for ritual hand-washing before meals and prayer. In a region where water was precious and often scarce, its use reflected both practical necessity and religious significance. Jesus' criticism of excessive ritual washing likely spoke to the burden this placed on poor households, where water was laboriously carried home each day. The morning meal was simple, often leftover bread from the previous day, perhaps dipped in olive oil or with a few olives. For many families, only 2 meals were eaten daily. This light morning food and a more substantial evening meal after the day's work was complete. Children might receive a piece of dried fruit or a handful of nuts to sustain them through morning chores. Work began immediately and was divided along clear gender and age lines that had both practical and cultural foundations. Men and older boys would depart for the fields if the family owned or leased land, or they would gather at village crossroads hoping to be hired as day laborers on larger estates. The uncertainty of day labor created tremendous anxiety for families. Would there be work today? Would the payment be fair? Would it be sufficient to feed the family? The gospel parable of laborers, hired at different hours of the day, reflects this economic reality. Women's work was equally demanding, but centered more around the domestic sphere. Though domestic in this context meant productive labor essential to family survival, not merely housekeeping. Women processed raw materials into usable goods, grinding grain, baking bread, spinning wool or flax into thread, weaving fabric, preserving foods, and managing household resources. Archaeological evidence shows the ubiquity of grinding stones and spindle whorls in home excavations, the tools of women's essential economic contributions. Children were integrated into the household economy from an early age. By 5 or 6 years old, children would be assigned age-appropriate tasks, gathering kindling, watching younger siblings, helping with animals, sorting lentils for stones. By adolescence, they would be fully apprenticed into adult work patterns, learning the skills they would need for survival. Education for most peasant children consisted not of formal schooling, but of this practical apprenticeship within the household economy. The physical toll of this daily labor was substantial. Skeletal remains from the period show evidence of degenerative joint disease, compressed vertebrae from carrying heavy loads, and teeth worn down from using them as tools, all indicators of lives spent in constant physical labor. The average lifespan was short by modern standards, perhaps 40 to 45 years for those who survived childhood, with many women dying in childbirth and men from accidents or the effects of hard labor. Yet within this demanding routine, the Jewish tradition wove moments of sacred pause. 3 times daily, morning, afternoon, and evening, Observant Jews would stop for prayer. These prayers, often recited while continuing to work, connected the mundane activities of survival with the covenant relationship between Israel and God. Even the most humble tasks gained meaning through this rhythm of prayer that punctuated the day. The Jewish Sabbath provided a more substantial interruption of labor, a complete cessation of work from Friday evening until Saturday evening. Archaeological evidence confirms that food preparation areas show signs of distinctive Sabbath practices, with special vessels set aside for this holy day. For poor families, Sabbath represented both a spiritual discipline and a physical necessity, a divinely mandated rest in lives otherwise defined by constant labor. Mealtimes were not merely about sustenance, but about reinforcing family and community bonds. The evening meal, especially, brought the household together after the day's scattered activities. Diners would recline or sit on mats around a common dish, using bread to scoop from shared portions. The father or grandfather would offer blessings over the bread and wine, if available, linking the family meal to sacred history and divine provision. Jesus' practice of breaking bread in fellowship and his use of food imagery in teaching grew directly from this cultural context where meals carried profound social and spiritual significance. Sleep came early to these households, shortly after darkness fell. Oil for lamps was expensive, making extended evening activities impractical for most families. The exceptions came during winter evenings or special celebrations, when stories might be told around the hearth's light. Stories of Israel's history, of family lineage, of God's faithfulness through generations. It was in these evening gatherings that collective memory was preserved and identity formed, particularly for children. The physical intimacy of shared sleeping quarters, common meals, and constant proximity shaped a worldview fundamentally different from our modern individualism. Personal identity was inseparable from family and community roles. The values that emerged from this physical reality, interdependence, mutual obligation, collective honor, formed the background against which Jesus taught. When he spoke of becoming family to those who follow God's will, he was invoking the most powerful social bond his listeners knew, the bond formed in these humble homes where survival depended on mutual support. The Jewish home was more than a physical structure. It was the center of religious practice and identity formation. Despite the temple's importance as the national religious center, most Jewish religious life unfolded not in Jerusalem, but within these humble village dwellings. The religious rhythms of the home created a continuous connection between everyday existence and covenant faith. The most visible marker of a Jewish home was the mezuzah, a small container affixed to the doorpost, containing parchment inscribed with the Shema prayer from Deuteronomy. Archaeological discoveries confirm this practice existed even in the poorest homes, where the mezuzah might be fashioned from simple clay rather than more expensive materials. This physical object embodied the commandment to keep God's words on the doorposts of your house and on your gates, making the threshold between home and world a sacred boundary. Within the home, ritual purity was a daily concern that shaped many practices. Archaeological excavations across Galilee have uncovered stone vessels in household contexts. Significant because, unlike pottery, stone vessels were considered impervious to ritual impurity. Even poor families might possess at least one stone cup or bowl reserved for situations requiring ritual purity. The Gospel account of water jars at the wedding in Cana specifically notes they were stone jars for Jewish purification rites, reflecting this widespread cultural practice. The rhythms of the Jewish calendar were observed primarily at home. While wealthier families might travel to Jerusalem 3 times yearly for major festivals, most poor families made this pilgrimage rarely, perhaps once in a lifetime. Instead, they celebrated festivals locally, with special meals and observances within the home. Archaeological evidence shows distinct changes in cooking and storage patterns around festival times, indicating special preparations even in humble households. Sabbath observance transformed the home weekly. Preparation began on Friday afternoon, cleaning, cooking food that could be eaten cold the next day, filling lamps with oil. When the first stars appeared Friday evening, the mother of the household would light the Sabbath lamps with a blessing, ushering in the day of rest. Archaeological findings include distinctive Sabbath lamps and special storage areas for Sabbath implements, confirming the material culture that supported this practice. The physical layout of villages often reflected religious requirements. Houses were typically clustered to facilitate the formation of an eruvi, the symbolic boundary that allowed certain activities on the Sabbath. Community mikvaot, ritual baths, have been discovered in numerous villages, often positioned near the synagogue, showing that even poor communities maintained the infrastructure necessary for ritual purity observances. Gender roles within the home were clearly defined by both practical necessity and religious tradition. Women managed internal household affairs, with authority over food preparation, textile production, and child rearing. Men represented the family in public space and religious obligations. Yet archaeological evidence suggests this division was pragmatic rather than rigid. Tools associated with both male and female work are often found throughout home spaces, indicating flexibility in daily practice. Children learned religious observance through direct participation and imitation rather than formal instruction. By helping prepare Sabbath meals, participating in festival celebrations, and observing adults at prayer, children absorbed not just practices, but the worldview underlying them. The physical arrangement of the home, where children observed all aspects of adult life, facilitated this embodied learning. Jesus' deep familiarity with Scripture likely came primarily from this household immersion rather than formal schooling, which would have been unusual for a carpenter's son. Family purity laws shaped intimate relationships and reproductive patterns. A woman's monthly cycle required temporary separation and subsequent immersion in a mikvah before resuming marital relations. Archaeological evidence of household partitions and community mikvaot confirm these practices were widely observed. The resulting pattern of periodic abstinence and reunion created a distinctive rhythm in marital relationships that was inseparable from religious identity. Meals carried profound religious significance beyond basic nourishment. Before eating, observant Jews would wash their hands with a blessing, not merely for hygiene, but as a ritual act acknowledging God's provision. Bread was blessed before breaking, and thanks were offered after eating. These practices transformed the necessity of eating into a continuous acknowledgement of divine sustenance. Jesus' blessing of bread at meals followed this established pattern, giving his final meal with disciples deep resonance with existing practice. Even illness and healing existed within a religious framework centered in the home. When gospel accounts describe Jesus entering homes to heal the sick, they reflect the reality that illness was primarily managed domestically, with family members providing care according to traditional practices that blended practical treatments with prayers and blessings. The physical vulnerability of illness was inseparable from spiritual concerns about purity and divine favor. Death, too, belonged primarily to the domestic sphere. The dying were cared for at home, bodies prepared for burial by family members according to traditional practices, and mourning rituals unfolded within the household. Archaeological evidence includes special vessels used in burial preparations found within domestic contexts. The tomb was ideally located on family property, maintaining the connection between the deceased and the household even after death. This integration of religious practice with everyday domestic life created a fundamentally different understanding of faith than our modern compartmentalization allows. For a first-century Jewish family, religion was not a separate activity reserved for special times or places, but the framework through which all of life was understood and experienced. The physical constraints and arrangements of these humble homes were not incidental to religious identity, but central to its formation and expression. With this contextual understanding of poor Jewish homes during Jesus' time, we can now approach the gospel narratives with fresh insight. The physical realities of domestic life illuminate many passages that might otherwise remain obscure to modern readers, while familiar teachings take on deeper resonance when placed against their original backdrop. Consider Jesus' parables, which frequently draw imagery from humble domestic settings. When he compares the kingdom of heaven to leaven that a woman mixes into dough, his audience would immediately visualize the daily bread-making ritual that occurred in every home. The woman kneading the dough in a wooden bowl, setting it aside in a warm corner of the single-room dwelling. The gradual transformation visible to all household members throughout the day. This was not a distant metaphor, but an image unfolding in their immediate lived experience. Similarly, when Jesus speaks of a woman lighting a lamp and sweeping her house to find a lost coin, his listeners would picture their own homes, dark interiors where valuable coins might easily disappear into the packed earth floor or between wall stones. The woman's urgent search makes perfect sense in an economy where a single coin might represent a day's food for the family. The rejoicing with neighbors reflects the intensely communal nature of village life, where economic survival and celebration were shared experiences. Jesus' teaching about building on solid foundations rather than sand would resonate powerfully with people intimately familiar with home construction and maintenance. Archaeological evidence shows many Galilean homes were built directly on bedrock when possible, with foundations cut into the limestone to provide stability. Those who could not afford prime building locations might build on less stable ground, facing collapse during seasonal flash floods, a reality Jesus' audience had likely witnessed in their own villages. When Jesus taught his disciples to pray for daily bread, he invoked the most basic domestic anxiety of poor households, having sufficient food for the day's needs. Archaeological evidence of small storage installations in homes confirms that most families lived with minimal reserves, making this prayer not a spiritual abstraction, but an urgent material need. The original Greek term epiousios, often translated as daily, may more precisely mean for the coming day, reflecting the day-to-day uncertainty of subsistence living. The gospel accounts of Jesus entering homes take on deeper significance when we understand the intimate nature of these spaces. When Jesus visits the home of Simon Peter in Capernaum, archaeological evidence suggests he would have entered a simple courtyard house, likely shared by multiple branches of Peter's family. His healing of Peter's mother-in-law occurred not in a private bedroom, but in the common family space, probably witnessed by the entire household. Her immediate response, rising to serve them, reflects both the cultural expectations of women's roles and the household's return to proper function when illness is healed. Jesus' interactions with Martha and Mary in their Bethany home illustrates the tension between hospitality obligations and religious learning. Martha's distraction with much serving would involve the labor-intensive preparation of food, arrangement of seating in a space not designed for guests, and the management of limited household resources to honor a visitor. Mary's choice to sit at Jesus' feet challenged gender expectations in a domestic space where women's roles were clearly defined around service and household maintenance. The famous account of 4 men lowering a paralyzed friend through a roof to reach Jesus makes perfect sense when we understand the construction of typical Galilean homes. Roofs consisted of wooden beams overlaid with branches and sealed with clay, a structure that required regular maintenance but could be relatively easily opened and repaired. The determination to reach Jesus by circumventing the crowded door speaks to both the architectural reality and the desperation of those seeking healing. Jesus' teachings about family relationships gain new dimension when viewed against the backdrop of the household's economic and social function. When he speaks of leaving father and mother to follow him, he challenges not merely emotional attachments, but the entire economic security system of ancient society. Without social security or retirement plans, parents depended on children, particularly eldest sons, for survival in old age. Jesus' call to prioritize discipleship over family obligation would have been heard as a radical economic statement, not merely a spiritual one. Perhaps most significantly, Jesus' frequent meals with tax collectors and sinners represent not merely social inclusivity, but a direct challenge to the purity boundaries that structured household life. By sharing food, prepared in a home's cooking space, served in its vessels, eaten in physical proximity, Jesus crossed barriers that maintained social and religious identity. His critics understood precisely what this commensality implied: a redefinition of who belonged within the intimate circle of covenant relationship. When Jesus compares the kingdom of heaven to a mustard seed that grows into a large plant where birds nest, he evokes the small household gardens that archaeological evidence confirms existed even in poor villages. His audience would have experienced the contrast between tiny seeds and substantial plants in their immediate environment. The unexpected growth from small to great would be observed firsthand in these domestic agricultural spaces, making the metaphor tangibly meaningful. The gospel narratives of Jesus' birth and childhood similarly reflect the realities of poor household life. Mary, giving birth in humble circumstances, with swaddling clothes and a feeding trough repurposed as a cradle, would not have seemed extraordinary to most Galileans accustomed to making do with limited resources. The flight to Egypt represents the kind of displacement many families experienced under political threat or economic pressure, often relying on extended family or village connections in new locations. Jesus' own household in Nazareth, described as that of a tekton, carpenter, builder, craftsman, would have been typical of the artisan class. Modest, but not destitute, with Joseph's skills providing somewhat more stability than day labor, but still vulnerable to economic fluctuation. Archaeological excavations in Nazareth reveal homes of roughly 700 square feet, often with workspace integrated into the living area, the environment in which Jesus would have learned his father's trade and observed family life unfolding around him. By recognizing how deeply the gospel narratives are embedded in the physical realities of poor Galilean homes, we gain a more textured understanding of Jesus' ministry and message. His teachings did not emerge from abstract theological reflection, but from intimate familiarity with the struggles, rhythms, and values of household life among the Am Haaretz, the common people who were both his family and his first followers. Remember the young woman we glimpsed in our opening scene, rising in the pre-dawn darkness to begin her daily tasks? Her movements through the small stone house, gathering water, preparing food, caring for family members, were not merely the background against which religious life happened, but the very substance of faith lived out in ordinary moments. The archaeological evidence reveals something remarkable about these humble dwellings. In many excavated homes from this period, small niches have been found in walls, spaces that likely held oil lamps during evening hours. The strategic placement of these niches maximized the light from precious oil, casting illumination across the greatest possible area of the living space. This practical adaptation to scarcity becomes a powerful metaphor when we recall Jesus' words. No one, after lighting a lamp, puts it under a basket, but on a stand, and it gives light to all in the house. The physical reality of these lamp niches, carved into the rough stone walls of humble homes, reveals how deeply Jesus drew his teaching imagery from the everyday world of his listeners. He did not need to explain this metaphor. His audience lived within its reality each evening as darkness fell. They understood intimately both the value of the light and the absurdity of concealing it. The spiritual application flowed naturally from their lived experience within these walls. Similarly, The archaeological discovery of threshold stones, worn smooth by generations of feet, crossing between inside and outside, illuminates Jesus' teaching about being the door. In homes where a single entrance served as the boundary between family space and public space, between security and vulnerability, the doorway carried profound significance. It was where the mezuzah was placed, where guests were greeted, where boundaries were maintained. When Jesus claimed this threshold imagery for himself, he was not creating an abstract theological concept, but locating himself within the most basic architectural feature of his listeners' daily lives. To conclude, reflect on how this journey through the homes of poor Jewish families transforms our understanding of the gospel message. The physical constraints, daily rhythms, and cultural practices that shaped these domestic spaces were not merely the setting for Jesus' life and teaching, but their very substance. He did not deliver abstract truths disconnected from lived reality, but spoke directly to and through the material conditions of ordinary existence. This historical understanding invites us to recognize the sacred within our own domestic spaces and daily routines. Just as divine wisdom emerged from the ordinary moments of first-century household life, the kneading of bread, the lighting of lamps, the sweeping of floors, so might we discover spiritual significance in our mundane tasks and relationships. The boundary between sacred and secular dissolves when we recognize, as Jesus did, that the kingdom of God is revealed not despite ordinary life, but through it. The homes of poor Jewish families in Jesus' time, humble as they were, contained the seeds of a faith that would transform the world. Within their stone walls, around their hearths, and through their daily struggles, the eternal took on flesh and dwelling. By understanding these spaces more fully, we gain not just historical knowledge, but spiritual insight, seeing how divine wisdom has always found expression through the most common elements of human experience. As we conclude this exploration, I invite you to look around your own living space with fresh eyes. Consider how your daily routines and physical environment shape your understanding of faith and community. The God who spoke through the humble homes of Galilee continues to speak through our domestic lives today, if we have eyes to see and ears to hear. If you found this historical journey meaningful, please like this video, share it with others who might appreciate this perspective, and subscribe to our channel for more explorations of the historical context that brings the biblical world to life. Your comments sharing how this information has impacted your understanding are always deeply appreciated. Thank you for joining me in this intimate glimpse into the forgotten reality that shaped the gospel message we continue to cherish today.